So I think it's time we talk about the Mimic again. So the Mimic is not simply a machine that copies things, and it's not just Edwin's program that he makes. The Mimic is clearly a more human-like character. The Mimic has a human element to it, and this is clearly pointed out to us in the Mimic story from the Pizzaplex books. Even before Edwin infuses it with his hate and rage, I would argue that the Mimic still has this human aspect to it. So when Edwin has created the Mimic in the books and shows it to David for the first time, they are both pleased with it. After David and Mimic's first play session, let me read you the following. Edwin laughed harder and stood. He leaned over and picked up Mimic as David jumped to his feet. David took Edwin's free hand. "I like Mimic," David said. Mimic reached out and wrapped his pincers around Edwin's wrist. Some primitive part of his brain felt a surge of fear. Would Mimic clamp down and hurt Edwin? No, Mimic's touch was gentle, even hesitant. Edwin relaxed and took his son and his son's new friend up the stairs. So this is the first hint that Mimic isn't simply mimicking David. The overly descriptive mention of the Mimic's touch not just being gentle, but hesitant, shows a level of trust that the Mimic is extending towards Edwin. We could argue that this is just the Mimic taking his hand because David took Edwin's other hand, but the story continues this sort of descriptive behavior much more explicitly later in the book. Another example soon comes up in the story when David is making Mimic his own plush to carry around, and so I'll read that to you. Later that day, he looked around and spotted David and Mimic by a pile of lace near the lever's machine. Both were bent over the lace, folding and refolding it. Edwin got up and walked over to his son. "What are you doing?" he asked. David looked up and grinned. Then he looked back at Mimic. "Is it ready?" he asked Mimic. Mimic nodded. Edwin's brows rose. This wasn't mimicking, it was responding. When had that happened? David leaned back and pointed at Mimic. Mimic opened his mouth in his version of a smile. Edwin blinked in amazement. Cradled in the curve of Mimic's left arm was an approximation of a tiger. It was made of lace and held together with string. David and Mimic had used the old material to form a head, a body, 2 arms, and 2 legs. They'd even managed to create little nubbins atop the head that looked like tiger ears. "Now Mimic has a tiger too," David said triumphantly. Edwin reached down and ruffled David's hair. "Yes, he does. Very well done. Very clever." David beamed. Mimic's eyes lit up brighter than usual. So the Mimic isn't just mimicking David here. The Mimic is legitimately interacting with the family on a human level. This robot is literally showing emotions. These are deliberately placed lines of the story that are showing us the Mimic is not simply the code that Edwin created. The Mimic has human-like qualities. This is not mimicking, this is straight up responding. The Mimic is a living creature in this sense. It isn't just responding either. The Mimic's eyes lighting up in this special moment shows us its actual delighted joy at being able to share the fun of having a plush like David does. It's heartwarming, and hearing the words of praise from Edwin, it's like there's so much more to this character than just being a code. That's clearly what the story is trying to tell us. One more I want to show you too real quick. Edwin crouched down in front of his son. This is after Edwin and David have a fight, and Edwin's trying to get back on David's good side and apologize. He says, "David, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I yelled." David wasn't in a forgiving mood. He turned away from Edwin and reached for Mimic. Mimic wrapped his pincer hands around David's fingers. That's not mimicking behavior either. That's like empathy. That's wanting to make sure David's alright, being a supportive friend for him. It's literally like what a friend would do in a situation like that. It's honestly crazy. So I just want to bring that up as we get closer and closer to the release of The Secret of the Mimic game, because the Mimic is not solely a killing machine and it's not solely just code. You have to remember that Edwin literally infuses the Mimic with his personal hatred and anger and rage, and so the Mimic, what started out as such a sweet character, is now infused with this absolute murderous intent. And so it's a much more complex character at this point, because it's not just a machine that's programmed to do certain things. While it is definitely still programmed to do those things, the point is that there's more to it than that. If it was just a mindless machine, it really wouldn't be that interesting. But when you have that human element to the character, that's where the story becomes a lot more intriguing for people, because in that sense, it kind of makes it more something that we can relate to. I like the idea of having a machine that's doing things because it's programmed to, but there's more to it than just the programming. And that makes it extra interesting to me, at least, especially as it could relate to Cassie and Gregory's story down the line. But let me know what you think.